I'm John Toole, Executive Director and CEO of the Computer History Museum, and I want to welcome everyone really for a great evening, an event we're going to have this evening. We've got a couple of just announcements, simple announcements, and I'm going to turn it over to one of our trustees, whom I'll introduce. The exits, you all know where the exits are, so keep the fire marshal happy. There's also a couple of very important people that we'd like to recognize who have sponsored this event. Allegiance Capital over here, plus some anonymous folks that really want to remain anonymous. And thank you so much for all of your support. Let's give them a big round of applause. Really makes a difference all the way across the board. And I'd ask everyone, Donna Dubinsky, who will be up next, has asked that everyone turn their cell phones on, just in case. Oh, sorry, Donna, I got it wrong. They said everything except a trio is okay. So we'd ask you to please turn your cell phones off if at all possible. I'd like to turn it over immediately to one of our trustees, Donna Dubinsky, who's really been a spectacular person in many different ways. As you probably can guess by now, and those of you who attend our receptions, people make it happen. That's what makes the museum work. That will continue to make the museum work. And I'm so proud that we've got people like you in the community and people like Donna and other trustees that really are involved with it. Donna is co-founder and CEO of Handspring. She previously, of course, was president of Palm Computing, vice president of Claris, director of distribution at Apple Computer, and director at Intuit Corporation. And of course, her piece de resistance has been trustee of the Computer History Museum. Let me introduce Donna Dubinsky. Thank you, Donna.
Thank you and welcome everybody. I got the honors of doing the introductory remarks this evening because I had the idea for this panel and put it together, and I was delighted that these gentlemen here were able to come. When I had the idea, I started asking a bunch of my friends in venture capital, if you had to name the 5 or 6 people who really created venture capital, who would they be? And I found an extraordinarily consistent list. And there were other people who were on the list who are not up here today, but these guys were on everybody's list. So it really is a tremendous opportunity to hear from them. Before we do that, though, I'm going to ask your indulgence for me to tell you a little bit about the Computer History Museum. I know a lot of you are new to the museum. You probably didn't even know it existed. So I'm going to spend 5-10 minutes or so to just tell you a little bit about who we are, and then I will be introducing Gordy, who's going to moderate the panel. So the history of this museum is that it started as an offshoot of the Boston Computer Museum. I'm sure many of you had visited the museum in Boston, or you may know it better as the host of the Computer Bowl. But it really was a split mission as a museum. It had children's type exhibits similar to we have at the Tech in San Jose, and it had this serious collecting of historical artifacts. And Gwen and Gordon Bell, along with Len Shustik, who is chairman of the museum, and is sometimes also known as my husband. Len, Gordon, and Gwen decided that this split charter wouldn't work, and that it wasn't, the historical artifacts were not getting the focus they needed, and perhaps it could move out here and be the basis for a new museum. So in 1995, they moved the collection out here, still affiliated with the Boston Computer Museum, and the Boston Computer Museum eventually closed, and this group became a totally separate nonprofit organization. So in 1999, it became an independent museum with its own board of trustees, and is that today. So why do we need another museum? Why have this museum? Well, when you ask a lot of thinkers and writers and researchers about what are the sort of most important inventions of the modern age, inevitably the computer comes to the top of the list. There's other important things, the steam engine, air conditioning, my personal favorite, the birth control pill. But there's certainly computers are always near the top of people's lists of the inventions that have really changed our lives. And it's pretty extraordinary that we've lived through a time of only sort of 50 years that have dramatically changed everything about how we play, how we live, how we work, absolutely everything. And we've lived through this, or much of this in some cases. And this has been just an amazing thing. And I believe it's our responsibility to collect the information of how this happened and what happened here and now for the benefit of future generations, for people who will be asking questions that we can't even think of today. So I think it's up to us to collect this while we can. Now, you may have noticed that it's not exactly a museum yet. People who were over in the collection earlier made some comments to me about that. What it is two things today. It's a collection and it's an institution. So on the collection side, it is today the world's most significant collection of computing artifacts. That's certainly a lot of hardware, but it's also software, it's videotapes, it's books, it's photos, it's papers. It's just an extraordinary collection, and there is none like it in the world today. And it's an institution. As an institution, it's got about 15 full-time staff, headed up by John Toole, who you just met. We have some of the staff and trustees here. If you guys want to all raise your hands just for a second so people can see who the staff and trustees are if you have any questions later. And the museum conducts regular tours of the collection. They have a huge number of wonderful volunteers, many of whom are here tonight, who act as docents, who restore machines to working order. There's an active collection program, so we continue to add to the collection. There's a tremendously successful lecture series. This is one of the evenings for it. Coming up soon is Chuck Geschke and John Warnock on November 12th, Steve Wozniak on December 10th, just to give you a feel of the sort of caliber of speakers. We also honor computing pioneers. We have our annual dinner coming up on October 22nd called the Fellows Dinner, where we induct computing pioneers into sort of a hall of fame for computer scientists. And soon, indeed, in addition to being a collection and an institution, it will be a museum as well, because we are in the process of acquiring a building. That deal is not yet closed, but I'll tell you a little about it. I think I'm allowed to, so I'm looking for John. Len's nodding. Okay, that's good. So you will know this building. It is at 1401 Shoreline, the former SGI Marketing and Sales building at Shoreline and 101. So I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's right across from the theaters. It's got a very interesting architectural view facing the theaters. And this is really a spectacular building. It's 120,000 square feet. We'll be occupying it in the spring if all goes well. And it will first be much like our visible storage here, which some of you saw over the artifacts, and eventually will be built out to real world-class exhibits with a lot more explanation and multimedia exhibits and so on. We also, I should mention, have a wonderful cyber museum project going side by side that will take access to the artifacts in the collection to even a broader level through the internet. So that's what we're working on. So I'd like to implore you to maybe help us if you think this is something important and interesting to do, and you can help us in a number of ways. First, you can join. There's membership information outside. Please join, get our mailings, and participate at that level. You can volunteer your time. You can come to lectures. You can be interviewed. You can give a lecture. Some of you are certainly have contributed at the point of being able to give these lectures. Please attend the Fellows Dinner, or even better, buy a table for the Fellows Dinner and invite some of your friends along who don't know about the museum and give them the opportunity to learn about the museum. Tell your friends there are regular open hours to get tours of the museum, of the collection today, and I highly recommend doing that, because seeing the boxes is one thing, but hearing the stories is really another thing, and it's the stories that bring them alive, and you need the docents to tell you that. Check your basements and garages for artifacts, for papers. No, we don't need any more IBM PCs, I don't think. But I'm sure many of you have really just wonderful artifacts, potentially papers, early business plans, things that would be really worth preserving. This is the place to preserve them. And finally, as the co-chair of the capital campaign, it would be remiss of me to not mention our upcoming $100 million capital campaign to finance the acquisition and building out of this building. We have not actually publicly announced the campaign yet, but we have received $53 million of pledges so far, so we're well on our way, and we feel like it's a great start to the campaign. And this is only going to happen if people like you help make it happen. We don't get government support, we don't get corporation support. This is really, the $53 million to date has been almost entirely from individuals with a few exceptions. So we hope that you will be able to support us in building this great institution. So that's my pitch, and I'm now going to turn to the real reason you came tonight. I could give you some sales pitch on Trio if you'd like that too, but you'd probably prefer that I move on, so I'll do that. So when I was putting together this panel, I tried to think of who would be a great moderator for this panel, and I went through and rejected and thought about a bunch of people who I just didn't think were right. And when I thought of Gordy Davidson and he accepted, I was really thrilled. I thought this was just the perfect choice because Gordy has not been a VC himself, but he's really had a ringside seat into the VC world. He has represented many of the companies that venture investors have funded, and he's actually represented some of the venture firms themselves as well. So he knows just about everybody on this panel, and it seems at least more than half the people in the room as well, from best I can tell. So I thought he was a perfect fit. Gordy is a partner in the corporate group and the chairman of the law firm of Fenwick & West. His clients range from startups to publicly traded companies. He has a few that you may have heard of: Cisco, Electronic Arts, Intuit, Oracle, Sun, just, a few of the companies around. Handspring, right. Most importantly. Gordy graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Stanford University in 1970 with a BS in electrical engineering, and then he got an MS in computer systems from Stanford in 1971. Graduated from Stanford Law School in 1974, so he's a techie turned lawyer. And I found this very interesting in the bio, Gordy. He was a member of the Order of the Coif, and I'm not sure what that is, and wonder if it has to do with hairdos or not. Maybe he can explain that when he comes up. He has worked as a computer systems engineer and as a law clerk in the United States Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco. He's been recognized many times for his work, including by Forbes magazine in February 2001 as one of the 50 most powerful venture capital deal makers. So I thought that was a particularly appropriate award for tonight. And with that, I'd like to have you join me in welcoming Gordy Davidson.
Thanks, Donna. I'm honored and surprised that Don Valentine allowed me to be the moderator tonight, since I know his general impression of lawyers. It is indeed my pleasure to have the opportunity to moderate this magnificent panel. Remember that word. I'm going to briefly introduce each one of them, and then we have a video, and then we'll go into more complete introductions. But on your far left is Bill Draper. To his right, to his left, Pitch Johnson, Burt McMurtry, Arthur Rock, Tom Perkins, Don Valentine. Originally, there was going to be a seventh panelist, Reed Dennis, who unfortunately had a conflict tonight, but he is represented here by his wife, Peggy. And this sets the stage for an idea that Don had. Don is a film buff, it turns out. And one of his favorite movies is The Magnificent Seven, which is, Reed is the seventh, not me. And the storyline is seven magnificent gunmen save a little village of farmers from the bandits. And you probably have seen it. You're going to see a little bit more of it right now. But the premise of this trailer is that in Don's mind, each of the actors is represented by one of the panelists. And we'll leave it to you to figure out how they match up. But let's run the video. That's you.
Winner.
One for the
McQueen, Coburn, Vaughn, Brunson, Buchholz, Dexter. The Magnificent Seven.
Even 5 wouldn't give us too much trouble.
There won't be any trouble. You ride on.
Ride on. I'm going into the hills for the winter. Where am I going to get the food for my men?
Hire to grow it. Or maybe even work for it.
Somehow I don't think you solved my problem.
We deal and live, friend. Solving your problems isn't that hard.
7 magnificent men in one magnificent motion picture. The Magnificent Seven.
Evening. Before we start, Don, I have a question for you. Are you the hero there, Yul Brynner, or are you the bandit, Eli Wallach?
I think I'd rather be Steve McQueen.
Anyway, it's a great film. Let me give you a more proper introduction of each of the panelists here. Bill Draper, again to your far left, has a long history in the venture capital business. In fact, he's the second of 3 generations of venture capitalists. We'll talk about that a little bit more. He's a graduate of Yale and Harvard Business School, worked at Inland Steel in sales where he met Pitch, more on that later. But in 1958, he joined his father in probably the first West Coast venture capital fund, Draper, Gaither, and Anderson. And then a few years later, hung out a shingle in 1962 with Pitch and formed Draper and Johnson, a small SBIC. In 1965, Bill was a founding partner of Sutter Hill Ventures, and then took a bit of a hiatus from venture capital and went into public service. In 1981, he was appointed chairman of the U.S. Export-Import Bank, and then later where he served till 1985, and then in 1985 he was appointed CEO of the United Nations Development Program. And then during that time in 1985, his son Tim founded Draper Fisher Jurvetson and another venture capital firm, rounding out the 3rd generation. In 1995, Bill returned to venture capital, founding Draper Richards, a private venture capital company, and Draper International, a venture capital fund that's focused on investments in India. He was a founding investor in, among others, Apollo Computer, Dionix, Integrated Genetics, Quantum, Cume, Activision, Zydex, MeasureX, Hybridtech, and LSI Logic. And I'm old enough to remember all of those companies. Pitch probably holds the record for managing the longest running venture capital firm in the country, Asset Management Company, which he's run since 1965. And as you came in, you might have seen the green poster, which is a genealogy chart that Pitch put together of the history of the venture capital funds, and begins with Draper, Gaither, and Anderson, and it just kind of goes who begat whom, and you see the history of all the venture capital funds through 1983. So it was the first 25 years of venture capital. Pitch is a Palo Alto resident, grew up in Palo Alto, bachelor's degree from Stanford, MBA from Harvard again. Served a tour in the Air Force and then joined Inland Steel, and I'm going to let Pitch tell about his toils in the plant there. In 1962, as I mentioned, he formed Draper and Johnson with Bill. And in 1965, he founded his own firm, Asset Management Company, which he continues to manage today. He taught for 12 years courses in entrepreneurship at the Stanford Business School and was a founding investor in, among others, Boole & Babbage, Tandem Computers, Amgen, IDEC Pharmaceuticals, and Applied Microcircuits. In fact, I worked with Pitch on Boole & Babbage, and Pitch served as chairman of that company for 30 years until it was acquired. Bert, on my right, has been in the venture capital business since 1969. He has a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Rice and a master's and PhD in EE from Stanford. He worked as an engineer for 12 years at Sylvania, and then after it was acquired at GTE for 12 years, and in 1969 he founded Palo Alto Investment Company with Jack Melchior. In 1973 he founded Institutional Venture Associates with Reed Dennis, who couldn't be here tonight, and in 1980 he founded Technology Venture Investors with Dave Marquardt. And he has served as a director of over 30 companies in his tour as a venture capitalist, and was a founding investor in, among others, Rome, KLA Instruments, NBI Inc., which we'll ask him about later, Nelcor, Triad Systems, Altera, SpectraLink, Verifone, and Intuit. Tom Perkins, we got the alphabet out of order here, is the founder of his namesake Kleiner Perkins, the Kleiner Perkins Venture Capital Fund, which has funded many of the companies that have defined Silicon Valley. Tom is also an engineer with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from MIT. 3 of us on the panel are electrical engineers, and 4 of the panelists are Harvard MBAs, including Tom. He was an early pioneer in lasers and founded a company called University Labs, which ultimately was merged into Spectrophysics. Tom was also the first general manager of Hewlett-Packard's computer division, where he served until 1972, when he was introduced to Gene Kleiner and founded the Kleiner Perkins Fund. He is currently a director of News Corporation and Hewlett-Packard, and was a founding investor in Tandem, Genentech, LSI Logic, Hybridtech, Collagen, Accuson, and a long list of others. Arthur Rock, to my left, is generally regarded as the dean of venture capital in Silicon Valley, and I had my introduction to Silicon Valley through Arthur at Apple and later at VisiCorp, which I hope we don't mention later in the program. Arthur has a bachelor's degree from Syracuse and an MBA from Harvard. He started as an investment banker after business school for a company called Hayden Stone in New York and arranged the initial financing of Fairchild Semiconductor in the 1950s. In 1961, he founded Davis and Rock with Tommy Davis and continued there until 1968, when Arthur, personally funded Intel Corporation with Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore. And in 1970, commenced investing through Arthur Rock and Associates, which he continues to today. He was a founding investor in Fairchild Semiconductor, Teledyne Semiconductor, Intel, Scientific Data Systems, Diasonics, Apple Computer, and Echelon, where he still serves on the board. Also serves on the board of the NASD Board of Governors. And then finally, on my far left, Don Valentine is the founder of Sequoia Capital, one of the oldest and most successful venture capital funds in Silicon Valley. He's played a key role in the formation of leading companies in semiconductors, personal computers, digital entertainment, and networking. He's a graduate of Fordham and got his start in sales and marketing at Fairchild Semiconductor, and then at National Semiconductor, where he met Bob Noyce. In 1972, Don founded Sequoia Capital and has been the lead investor in, among others, Atari, Apple, Electronic Arts, Altos Computer, Pyramid Technology, LSI Technology, Linear Technology, Microchip Technology, C-Cube Microsystems, and Cisco. I'd like to start the questions, and at the end we'll have time for questions from the audience, and we'll send microphones around. But for a little while now, I'd like to kind of guide the questions, and I wanted to kind of get to the beginning, and since this is the Computer History Museum, find out really how it all started. I mean, the panelists are the pioneers of the venture capital business on the West Coast, but I want to find out who was first. Was it Bill or was it Arthur? Now, Bill joined Draper Gaithorn Anderson in 1958, but Arthur claims the first deal that actually got done. So, who was first, guys?
You got a coin?
Yeah, I'd say it's flip of a coin.
Art, tell us about the funding of Fairchild.
Fairchild Semiconductor, yeah.
Fairchild Semiconductor.
Well, there were these scientists who were working for the Shockley Laboratory division of Beckman Instruments. Shockley, of course, had won the Nobel Prize for, it was one of three people who won the prize for Nobel Prize for inventing the transistor. And he was working in New Jersey at Bell Laboratories, and somehow had a change in lifestyle. He divorced his wife, moved out to California. He was actually born and raised in Palo Alto, and got Beckman to back him. And because of his Nobel Prize, was able to get, and he's very well known at that time, he was able to get any scientist he wanted to work for him. And after a couple of years, this must have been 1955, and by 1957, most of the people had been fed up with Shockley. He was a very, very difficult man, details of which I can go into, but I don't want to take the time. But in any event, 7 of those scientists got together and said, we're going to leave. Of course, there was no venture capital in those days, and they thought, gee, wouldn't it be nice if we could get a job together at some company? And one of Gene Kleiner's father had a brokerage account at Hayden Stone where I worked, and he wrote a letter to his father's. Is this going on too long?
That's good.
Okay.
We had the Magnificent 7, but I think we had the treacherous 8 here, right?
That's absolutely right. the Magnificent Seven started the ball rolling, and then were able to convince Bob Noyce to join them, and they then became the Treacherous Eight. I got this letter and came out and talked to these fellas and decided that we would agree to form a company and try to raise $1.5 million. So we went around to 35 companies before we found, and we completely decided we couldn't do it. And then luckily I ran across Sherman Fairchild, who was the single largest holder of IBM stock. And he was an inventor and quite a gentleman. And he had invented the aerial camera and then had to invent an airplane to put the camera in. So there were two companies, Fairchild Camera and Instrument and Fairchild Aerospace. And so we got Fairchild Camera and Instrument to loan $1.5 million to this new company we set up, Fairchild Semiconductor, in return for which the 8 scientists each owned 10% of the stock, and Hayden Stone owned 20%, and we gave Fairchild Camera and Instrument an option on our stock, and that brought the silicon into Silicon Valley. Because if there hadn't been this deal, I think the 7 of them would have gone their own separate ways, and barring some other fortuitous circumstance, I don't think there would have been any silicon in Silicon Valley.
Bill, how about you? How did you get your start in venture capital?
Well, I had the right father. I got out here when he had he came out with a guy named Fred Anderson, who had worked with him when they were both working on the Marshall Plan in Paris. And Fred was a great guy. He had been head of the 8th Bomber Command, and he came out here and did a few deals. And my dad worked with him, having been in the Dillon Reed investment banking firm. And they backed Raychem, which was a big winner. And so on the basis of what was starting to happen in Silicon Valley, technology, a few people, Rockefellers and a couple of others, put money in, and it was a total of $6 million. And that $6 million carried a big article in Business Week about a business starting out here in the West Coast. At that point, American Research and Development was General Dorio, and since we're a lot of us Harvard Business School types, we bow down when we hear the name. But he started that, and it started DEC, and Bell is here, and we were the first ones on the West Coast. There was, of course, J.H. Whitney and the Rockefellers themselves had done some things in New York, but we were really the first. It was exciting, and the West was just opening up. And wallets were smaller then, but since the stock market declined recently, I'm kind of hoping some of the lifestyle will climb, because we had a lot of, it was an easier community. And when Pitch and I got going, there were really orchards out there, and it really was a valley of a charming place, and we've spoiled it totally, you guys, because it was a great place to live, and it's a little too much angst now for me, but we've had a wonderful life. I mean, it's just going back, we all get a little teary going through that museum. It brings back memories that are very fond, and all these guys were good buddies, and we worked in a lot of different way then. It's a lot more cooperative, and than it is now, but we'll get into that more later.
Well, Pitch, you took your MBA from Harvard and went to work in a steel mill. How did that happen?
Well, I wanted to be a production guy. That was my aim. I was a mechanical engineer, and I thought, yeah, I'd like to produce something so that something goes out the door at the end of the day. And I had a summer job in a steel plant, and I liked it a lot, so I got a job with Inland Steel working in the open hearth. The first 2 or 3 years, I just did regular, work, and then I eventually became a foreman, and I worked shifts almost all the time I was there. So it was, for me at least, it was exciting, and it was smoke, flames, dirt, and stuff that appealed to me. And I never did really understand the guys from HBS who wanted to go be investment bankers and all that stuff. I didn't understand what they did. In fact, I still don't actually understand.
We'll have Arthur explain it to you.
Guys like Arthur. But then I really was happy as a clam because I really loved the work, and our children were arriving and all that good stuff. So, however, I had an option. They gave me an option on 42 shares, and that was good because they shared the ownership with everybody, and it was a great company. But I went to the annual meeting, and I was looking through the proxy statement. I noticed that the grandchildren of the founders each had 469,000 shares or some such number. I thought, wait a minute, I was really brilliant. I thought, you said about AHA. I thought, I'd like to get into something that actually where I can develop some ownership. I had a good salary, so really I didn't have any complaints, and I loved the work. So about that time, this was a little after Bill had come out, we had known each other. We lived in the company houses right by the mill together, and we knew each other well, and so they invited us to come out to visit them in Palo Alto, where I came from in the first place, and go to the big game, I guess it was. And so Bill, he said, you're really working pretty hard. He said, I can tell you about a way to earn a living without actually doing anything. and so we cooked up Draper & Johnson in the venture capital business, and we did it over his kitchen table. So I learned early on that you really can't start a company without a kitchen table. So I quit my job with tears in my eyes. Basically, I could hardly tell my boss I was leaving. He was just, it was one of those relationships. So we came out and started our company, and that's how I got in.
Well, Pitch, when I talked to you before this event, you said, and I quote, "Fire, smoke, sweat, steel. The most fun I ever had was my first turn as a melter."
Yeah.
And my question for you is, weren't you there 10 years?
I worked for 8 years, yeah.
8 years. I mean, it took you a long time to have that aha moment, didn't it? I mean,
Well, I was having such a good time. I mean, we all, wise people tell us when we're young, get a job you enjoy, and I really loved that work. And I just got, maybe going to Harvard Business School was an error, but I just got the thought that I really ought to try to build capital in some way, and this Bill, when we talked it over, showed me how that might happen. So, but I recommended people that like that kind of work do it. Kids ask me a lot, should I go into investment banking or consulting and all that stuff, and I say, why don't you go get an actual job and sell something, right, or make something or design something for quite a while, because that's what business does. The rest of us, if I might say so, are enablers, to use the nicest possible phrase.
And that doesn't include lawyers. Bert,
I don't recommend anyone do that.
Bert, you also had a real job before you became a venture capitalist. Tell us about that.
I did. I worked for a dozen years for Sylvania GTE here in Mountain View, and like Pitch, liked it a lot. Had a wonderful time. And then I didn't have an aha moment. I had sort of a long pause. At about my 11th year in the firm, it occurred to me that I really did not want to work in a big company. I wanted to somehow get into a small company. But I was so busy doing what I was doing, and I've always been good at convincing myself that I'm enjoying what I'm doing when I'm doing it, that I never could figure out what I might do. And about this time, Jack Melchor, who I had gotten to know somewhat, and who had started 2 companies successfully here, Mel Labs and HP Associates, had decided to leave Hewlett-Packard and set up a seed capital, venture capital operation in Los Altos, and asked me to join him. And I'm very impressed with Jack. I thought it would be a fun thing to do, and it would be a mechanism for me to figure out what kind of a small company I might like to get into. I really didn't think I'd be in the venture capital business for very long. I didn't know much about it, but I had, like Pitch, I had never thought of my view of venture capital was so far from where actual work got done that it was peculiar, and I thought I would really want to be back with my hands on something more than venture capital would be. But I joined Jack and began that activity and continued it for a long time. We had a wonderful time. It was a very tough time in the business in the late 60s, a capital-starved climate that tended to enforce collaboration, which was good. It was also enforced at the level of patience that I would not like to have to repeat. It took 6 years and 2 months until we had the first realized gain on any of our investments. It was painful.
And tell me the multiple.
It worked well, finally. We started with $3.3 million, which was a lot of money in those days, and by the ninth and 10th year, it was worth over $100 million.
Pretty good result even for the bubble, right? Tom, you were also an engineer before becoming a venture capitalist and a businessman. What led you to venture capital?
Well, I kind of became a venture capitalist as a byproduct of being an entrepreneur. When I graduated from Harvard Business School, I came to work for Hewlett-Packard, which was a very small company in those days. I was, I think, the first MBA that they'd hired. In fact, I met Hewlett-Packard for the job interview in New York, where they were personally setting up their booth at a trade show. I helped them, and they offered me a job. But when I came out to Palo Alto, they had second thoughts about introducing an MBA directly into anything that might be important. So I actually worked in the machine shop for 6 months, running lathe and mill and getting to know the company a little bit. That was sort of the HP way, is to be very cautious about something like that. Anyway, so then I did start doing things at HP, and along the way I got involved with starting the first commercial computer business for Hewlett-Packard, and I was the first general manager. Bill Davidow, who was here, was marketing guy, and we had a lot of fun doing that. But I had an idea for making a new kind of laser that came to me, and I had 2 sales to make. One was to convince my wife to take our modest life savings, which I think was $15,000 that we've been saving to buy a house, and persuade her to let me spend that money on experiments to see if this thing would work. And then the second sale I had to make was to Dave Packard, because I didn't want to leave HP. I loved the job, and ask him if he would mind if I pursued this invention on the side. And he amazingly said, no, why don't you do that? So I did, and the laser worked, and we went into production. There was long stories about eking along on $15,000 to start a multi-million-dollar laser company. But anyway, along the way, I encountered Bill Draper, a venture capitalist, raised some capital from him and from a handful of other individuals. And the company was very successful, and we merged it into spectrophysics. And after it was all over, I realized that, I'd started it, I'd been chairman of the board, I'd seen it from very beginning to success, but I'd never actually worked there, and I'd probably been a venture capitalist. So I decided then with Eugene Kleiner to do that full time, and we set up Kleiner Perkins in 1972. We raised $8 million, which at the time was the largest fund in the world, and it's been fun ever since.
And Don, you came from sales and marketing. As a matter of fact, in the research I did on the internet, the web is a wonderful thing. It says Don was known back in the Fairchild days as the toughest and best dressed salesman that Fairchild had.
Nothing's changed. Well, in thinking about a beginning, I thought about the concept of this idea of 6 degrees of separation. Remember, Arthur has already explained that he arranged the financing for Fairchild. I joined Fairchild in the very late 50s, late 59, and was among the first 100 employees and among the first people in sales. And I didn't go to a famous business school in the East. I went to a famous business school in Mountain View called Fairchild Semiconductor, and had the benefit of working closely eventually with Bob Noyce, who was one of the great intellects, one of the great innovators, and one of the fairly few who were able to conceptualize the future and articulate it purely. After 7 years or so at Fairchild, when revenues reached about 150 million, a number of us decided to start another silicon company. And I remember when I was leaving, and this is in '67, Bob said, "It's too late to start a semiconductor company. All of the great semiconductor companies are started, and you're too late." Parenthetically, when he was leaving in '69, I placed the same call. And I said, "Bob, it's 1969. How can it not be too late by 2 years?" A man of great humor as well as imagination. While in both these companies, both of which were public, National Semiconductor second, Fairchild Semiconductor first, I appeared quite often in security analyst meetings, I suspect because of my theatrical bent. I didn't have to use movies then. And a large mutual fund company in Los Angeles approached me to manage funds from their clients invested in private companies, what they thought of in those days as private placements. The term I don't think had even been coined by any of my predecessors. I think the word venture capital came along later. I'm not sure who the author is and when it happened, but I began raising a fund in 1972 and went into business at Sequoia in 1972 with the second largest fund in North America, behind Kleiner Perkins.
I want to ask each of the panelists now to tell us about your first big hit. And Arthur, let's again start with you. It has to be Intel, right?
No, I don't think so.
No? All right.
I can't tell you whether SDS or Teledyne were bigger hits, but they were very, very big deals. SDS really made the first computer for scientific purposes. Our first big sale was to Jet Propulsion Laboratories.
In fact, as a plug for the History Museum, there is a XDS computer over at the other building, and I remember programming one when I got out of college.
And we got Xerox, in their great wisdom, as you know, Xerox is one of the best managed companies in the United States. And in their great wisdom, they decided, IBM was going, this was in 1968, IBM was going into the copier business, so they thought the only thing they could do, this we all learned later, if we'd known this in advance, maybe we wouldn't have done the merger. But in their great wisdom, they decided, well, the only way to compete with IBM, if IBM's going to compete with us, we're going to compete with IBM. So they came around and offered us an offer we couldn't refuse, and bought the company for what was then a huge sum of money. And we would have been remiss in not selling it to them, but we found out later what I just told you, that they had decided to compete with IBM, and they wanted us to change our business model and make business computers. Well, you can imagine what kind of success they had at that, and that just didn't work. But that was a huge deal at the time.
An investment of $250,000 turned into what?
Probably $100 million.
1969?
Yeah, that was just phenomenal in those days.
Not bad in 2002 either. Bill, what was your first big hit?
The first big hit was not so big in today's terms, but it was big to me. We at Sutter Hill backed a company called Cume behind a guy named David Lee, who invented the daisy wheel printer. And the daisy wheel the printers are here in the museum, but they're not out on display quite as big as I would like. But the IBM, had the golf ball kind of typewriter, and this guy who was Chinese born, a wonderful guy, many of you know him, came up. We had backed him in another deal called Diablo, and he was the vice president of engineering. And so he and his partner, after that was sold, decided to start this company called Cume. And we got a good match up. We brought in the right person to help really do the management side, Harvard Business School. And then, sure enough, if you go to any Harvard Business School Entrepreneur of the Year Award, which I was president of that association at the time and thought we ought to have an Entrepreneur of the Year Award. So you'll always see the list, and it always starts with Cume, and that gives me a great feeling. And Cume turned into I don't know, it was something like we sold it for $150 million, and we had only put in $1 million, and the company was sold to IT&T. The feeling about that is really good, both for the fact it was started by an immigrant, which I've continued to believe in very much. We started this company, Draper International, to focus on India, and we backed a lot of great Indians here in the Valley, but a lot of them also in India. And that was the beginning of my relationship that it really has changed Silicon Valley. I mean, the immigrants in Silicon Valley have done a huge amount. And of course, all of us would admit quickly that the reason we're up here, or anybody even knows about us, is because of the entrepreneurs we backed, like our chairman here, Donna and Heidi, and lots of others. So I just love that little story about. But I got to tell you, when we presented the Entrepreneur of the Year Award to Cume, there were probably, I don't know, 10 tables or something like that. It was a little deal in San Francisco. But this was this guy's proudest moment. And David Lee, and I told him to park his brand new BMW at the Bohemian Garage, which is right nearby where we were going to be. And we walked out together, my wife and him, my wife and me and his wife and him. And we turned in our check, and they said, "I'm sorry, we have bad news. Your car was stolen." So here he was, kind of on the top of the world, and this big, bright BMW that he had just bought. Anyway, you knew, David, because you were in the deal.
Bert? I didn't steal it.
Bert, how about yours? What was your first?
The first big hit, as I told you earlier, it took a long time to happen, but it was a company called Rome, a telecommunications company. It actually started making rugged mini computers and then financed its way into the PBX business in the mid-'70s. And it was started by 4 guys, 3 of whom I had hired to come to GTE. And the 4th I tried very hard, and he went to IBM instead, which made me very unhappy. But Richardson, Oshman, Lowenstern, and Maxfield were the source of the name Rome. And we invested there. Jack actually, Melchor was the 5th founder of Rome. He was a financial guy. provided the initial financing along with the founders, and then a year later, in 1970, we invested through Palo Alto Investment, and then in 75, we invested through Institutional Venture Associates. And in 1976, the company went public, and my first IPO I was associated with, and it sold below its offering price for the first 15 months that it was a public company. But then it proceeded to move upward, and after a very few years, and through the time it was later sold to IBM, if you held that stock, the people who bought the stock of the public offering made 40 times their money. So it was a very successful venture and lots of fun, lots of energy associated with it.
Bert, I have to tell a story about a board that you and I worked on together. I won't name the company, but in the bubble, the stock went public at 15 and shot up to 51. And I remember the first board meeting after that, and Bert said, the high stock price is a wonderful validation of the business that we think we're in. But apart from that, there's nothing else good about a high stock price the day after your public offering. And those were somewhat prophetic words in the case of that company. But Tom, how about yours? What was your first big hit?
Tandem Computers. It came fairly early in the Kleiner-Perkins partnership, and Kleiner and I were very hands-on oriented in our venture investment, as a lot of entrepreneurs will complain about. But Tandem was carried it even further. Jimmy Trybig, who had worked for me at Hewlett-Packard, joined Kleiner-Perkins as a partner, and did our famous snowmobile deal called Snow Job, but we won't talk about that. Anyway,
we did that one too.
Anyway, it just goes to show you we can make a few mistakes sometimes. But Jimmy had been thinking about a fault-tolerant computer for some time. He tried to persuade Hewlett-Packard to go into that business and was not successful in doing that. And after he joined Kleiner-Perkins, he continued to work on that idea with some help from Bill Davidow and myself. And we decided to finance it 100% out of the partnership. A few months later, Pitch Johnson came on board as our only validating outside investor. Thank you, Pitch. And we spun Tandem out of Kleiner-Perkins and put in another Kleiner-Perkins employee as the chief financial officer. And let's see, that happened in 1974, and we took the company public, I believe, in 76. So it came fairly quickly and was a successful IPO, and the company grew for 30 years, and until it was acquired, not quite 30, 27 years, I guess, until it was acquired by Compaq, which was another Kleiner-Perkins startup. So, and it was a very successful investment for all those years.
Pitch?
Well, the first deal I did that really became very valuable was Boole & Babbage. The problem was it took 30 years.
Patient capital.
Yeah, but having been a private investor rather than someone managing other people's money, I've actually, to be serious, I've had a chance to wait out things that you can't really do when you've got to get some returns back to limited partners. So Boole & Babbage went up and down, and we finally merged it out with BMC only about 5 years ago when we started in 1967. But I'd have to say the first one of any normal quick turnover was in fact Tandem that got involved with Tom. And just a little inside story, we had some arguments in our office. I had a terrific young associate named Brooke Byers with me, who's here tonight, by the way. And Brooke basically talked me into that, Tom. So you've always given me credit for backing you, but I think Brooke talked fast and talked well, and that's why we did that deal. But it was Tandem was certainly the first of any normal length of time, and was a big success.
By the way, Brooke told me, and this was written up in the Stanford Business School Alumni Magazine, that he was inspired to become a venture capitalist by a brown-bagged lunch that he attended while a business school student, where Pitch and Bill and Reed were the panelists. So I guess the rest is history on that one, too.
Panels are habit forming.
That's right. Don, how about you? Big hit.
The first investment we made was Atari. And Atari was started by one of those legendary Silicon Valley personalities, Nolan Bushnell. The business initially was a business of coin-operated games located all around bars, restaurants, any kind of facilities where young singles congregated. And it was a spectacular success. Nolan is the father of electronic games in most histories, and the momentum and success of the coin-operated games led us into making a consumer game called Pong, which was retrospectively one of the world's most boring, limited graphics, limited everything. But we couldn't finance it. We're now in the early 70s. We could finance the coin-operated business out of profits and cash flow and a bit of borrowing. But in order to be in the consumer business, Sears, who was going to be our #1 customer, wanted a guarantee that we could supply 50,000 units before Christmas. I wasn't sure what Christmas they were talking about. Regrettably, it was a Christmas coming. And Nolan, who was a fabulous entrepreneur and appropriately avaricious, was very concerned about dilution that it would take to figure out how to finance and front-end the production and continued production growth. So we ended up making a deal with the then legendary Steve Ross at Warner. And he and a few of his lieutenants effectively financed that season and the takeover of the Atari company, which once they poured money into it, in a few short years had revenues in the billions of dollars, and this is in the mid-70s. A fabulous company, unfinanceable at the time, and one that Nolan only got modestly rich doing, to his regret.
Arthur, tell us about Intel. Tell us about the founding.
Well, to continue on the story with Fairchild Semiconductor, Sherman Fairchild passed away during the middle of this period from 1957 till when Intel was formed in 1968. And the company was, Fairchild Cameron Instrument was run out of Syosset, Long Island. And the management there was very East Coast and very prim and proper. And they could not understand the need to give any equity to any of the people on the West Coast at Fairchild Semiconductor. And finally, in the last year, Fairchild Semiconductor was making 110% of the profits of Fairchild Cameron Instrument, and 6 of the 8 Fairchildren had left to do other things because they were unhappy with the management. And finally, Noyce and Moore had a showdown with them, and then they left and formed Intel. And I remained friendly with Bob and Gordon, and they called me one day and said, "We're going to do this." And I said, "It's about time." And they said, "Well, we'll need about $2.5 million. And I said, "You got my word for it." And in space, there were no fax machines or email or anything like that, so no answering machines. So it took me a day and a half to reach all the people I wanted to reach, and we raised the money, and the rest is history.
Arthur, before the panel, Bill Davidow reminded me that you're legendary for requiring the founders to put up a third of their net worth or something when you start a company. Did that happen with Fairchild, and did it happen again with Intel?
Well, at Fairchild, each of the founders had to put up $500 to buy their interest, and that was probably 100% of their net worth. At Intel, each Noyce and Moore put up $250,000, which I think was well in excess of a third of their net worth. But we all had faith, and things went just swimmingly.
Don, I know Noyce had an influence on your career, Atari to Apple to Electronic Arts and so on. How did you apply what you learned from Bob Noyce?
Well, everybody thinks of Bob appropriately as a world-class scientist and someone whose name is on the patent for the microprocessor. But to me, Bob Noyce was also a fabulous marketing mind. And he was in the business of creating markets in an anticipatory way, and then creating products that would create those markets uniquely for first Fairchild and second Intel. And I had grown through the Fairchild ranks to be the head of sales and marketing. So I had a direct long-term interface with Bob on the conceptualizing, his conceptualizing, me implementing, his visions of what could be done in silicon. And remember, this was a company that was virtually the first company able to produce in volume anything in silicon. It was then a very exotic new material in the late 50s and early 60s. And Bob was able to see and articulate the future clearly enough to arrange product development internally that would cause Fairchild to be the dominant supplier of silicon in history and Intel to be the dominant supplier of microprocessors. At one point in time, and Arthur probably knows this story infinitely better than I as a board member, Intel had all of the useful patents that there were to have in memories. And this is before the real explosion in microprocessors. And a decision was made, however, to turn their backs on these memories, which are highly repetitive and relatively easy to manufacture products by comparison to microprocessors. And they were visionary enough to turn their backs on what was control of a worldwide market in pursuit of yet a better and different market. What are the facts, Arthur?
The facts are that we were driven into it by the Japanese. That was the most gut-wrenching experience I had as a board member, and more so for, it was really Grove and Moore who drove that decision. And we really had no choice. We were losing money, and the Japanese were eating our lunch. They were making a higher quality product and selling it below cost, and there was no way we could compete or catch up. And just as was said, we turned our backs on it and decided to exploit the microprocessor. But that was we had to lay off a third of the staff, close plants, lost a lot of money. Stock went way down, but it was the right decision. And I don't know many companies that could make that kind of decision, either before or after.
You know, there are a lot of companies that you all backed that changed their plan. I mean, Bert mentioned Rome. Compaq changed its plan, right? They started off as a disk drive company. Are there any other examples where companies through one course of sea change in the market had to change, make a spectacular shift in their Compacted?
No.
Well, when the guys,
When they came out of TI, they were going to build
when
a
the founders
district.
wanted to do
they
it,
never
but
did
They never did that. All right.
Ben Rosen
Right.
sort of got them straight very early.
Right. We talked about some spectacular successes. How about investments that got away? Is there a deal that you didn't do that you wish you had done? Start with you, Don.
Gordon told me this was going to be a question 2 weeks ago, and I've been racking my mind since.
No bad deals.
Microsystems.
No, but the story that I think I would like to tell is a non-obvious bad decision. Very early on, and this theme, by the way, of 6 degrees of separation is a continuum throughout everything I've ever been associated with. I neglected to mention in finishing the Atari story that there was an 18-year-old senior tech in the bowels of engineering at Atari whose name was Steve Jobs. But anyway, back to the less heady story that Gordon's insisting on telling. Through a set of connections, I met early on a great engineer, great entrepreneur by the name of Andy Bechtolsheim. And at that point in time, I was invested in a company called Altos, a then small public computer company, a multi-user, very simple computer company. And the founder had persuaded me that Andy's idea would make a fabulous product within Altos. And rather than listening carefully to what Andy wanted to do, I listened carefully to what Dave Jackson, the president of Altos, wanted to do, and attempted to persuade Andy and company not to form Sun Microsystems as an independent company, but to make it an adjunct division of Altos. Well, history would suggest that was a terrible idea and a terrible sales job. Other people more wisely approached the team with the idea of having their own freestanding company. And from my point of view, it was a matter of personally not listening to the right speaker. I was listening to the man with whom I was partnered in a computer company that was successful, who had a vision about distribution and manufacturing, and Sun had nothing, not even a name then. But the founders were appropriately uninterested, found financing elsewhere, and formed an independent great company, which far outshone in the final analysis anything Altos Computer ever did. Now that's a terrible story to have to share publicly.
The entire panel will get their chance. Tom, you did do Sun Microsystems, or Kleiner did, but you didn't do Apple. What happened there?
Well, I never met Steve Jobs. I was scheduled to, but I looked at, I think, 2 or 3 computer kits in the month or so preceding the meeting. And I didn't like any of them, rightfully so. And Steve came along with, I thought, another computer kit. So I actually didn't schedule the meeting and missed that one.
And Bert, Pitch, and Tom did tandem, but you let that one slip through your fingers?
We missed that, and it was a gigantic miss.
Well, I think Rome, Ken Oshman was a neighbor of mine. We happened to cross paths running in the same park, quite often. And so we sat down. He was less out of breath than I, but we sat down and he talked about starting a new company that would do ruggedized military computers. And I knew he was a terrific guy and a Rice graduate, if I remember right. And so I said, well, you know, Ken, I just don't like military-related businesses, and so I don't think I'm the right guy to talk to. And that's wrong.
That's wrong.
but it wasn't that great a business, but the fact was they were a great group, and they changed their business model. So there is some lesson there about if there's some really terrific people, don't ignore them because they may very well figure out something to do.
Art, we talked about Ben Rosen setting up Compact. That's one that you passed on.
I passed on that very early, but the main one I passed on was the same one Pitch did. Ken Ashman came to see me and presented his business plan, and I said, gee, you've had no experience, you've had no business sense, you have this ruggedized computer, all you're doing is ruggedizing a DEC computer. I said, Ken, I got to tell you, I'm going to pass. I just don't like this deal. And several years later, many years later, we hired him to run Echelon Computer. And he said to me one day, he said, you know, he said, if I were you, I would have passed on Rome too.
Bill, is there one that got away from you?
Oh yeah, we had brought Rockefeller Brothers into Venrock, into a company called Apollo that we had backed at Sutter Hill, which was a big success, and later sold to Hewlett Packard. But we got a call. I got a call from Peter Crisp at Rockefeller at Venrock, and he said, you know, we'd like to have you come into Apple Computer. And I said, well, what's Apple Computer? And he said, well, it's a company right down your way. Why don't you go check it out? Well, I, being a guy who liked to develop teams, and a later question coming on is how you develop your team. So I had hired this guy, Len Baker, who many of you know is very #1 in his class out of Yale math and stuff like that. And very sharp guy. So I said, Len, why don't you go down and look this over? Len came back and he said, well, this guy, you know, little, very arrogant guy. and he explained that he really thought, you know, it just wasn't probably right for us, that this guy was hard. I mean, it kept him waiting, and he wondered what he wanted. What were you here for? And so Len said, I think we ought to pay. So I said, well, Len, if you think we ought to pass, we ought to pass. And so there was a great, I mean, he turned into a terrific venture capitalist, but we missed the big one. Apple would have been a beauty.
You know, there's been a long-running debate between Art and Don, and I'd be curious to know what the other panelists think. Sort of the venture capital version of nature versus nurture. Do you back a team, as Bill suggested, or do you back a market or a plan? And Art, you'd say back the team, right?
Every time.
Bill, you agree with that?
Every time.
Pitch?
Yeah, I'm on the team group, and Don and I have had that discussion a lot.
Bert? Tom?
No. I think some of our most successful deals were done without a team, where we backed an entrepreneur, a single person who may not have had that much experience, and we ourselves provided the team part of it until we could get the thing off the ground. And I would debate this one intensely, because I think if you insist upon a team at the very beginning, when the risk is very high, let's say you've got a great technical person as the CEO, why would the best possible marketing person for that venture, why would he join you? There's nothing to market, the risk is enormous. It's better to get it going, get rid of the technical risk, reduce it to practice of some sort, and then go out and hire the best marketing man in the world, person in the world, who you'll then be able to hire. And in the interim, you provide all that stuff, including the finance, everything. And at Kleiner Perkins, we've done this for 30 years, and so our formula differs from...
No, but I don't think he meant that.
You reframed the
I don't
question.
think any of us meant that.
But Don has a different take on this. Don, what's your...
I mean, a lot of us have backed
Just to
one
put it
person
straight,
and then
I
built the
agree with
team
Tom
out.
100%.
It's the market versus people argument that.
Yeah.
that
I
I
think
thought it
that's,
was a team versus...
No, no,
But what's
no.
really interesting is we have Tom and Don agreeing on something, which is an unusual event.
He hasn't agreed yet.
I don't,
Are you uncomfortable about that?
I'm scared.
But Don, you take a different position. You say back the market every time and find the team later, or replace the team.
Remember, I went to Fairchild Semiconductor as a training ground in marketing. So I look at the world from a point of view of what kind of problems there are, what kind of applications there are to be solved, what the timing is of technologies that can solve those problems, and we look at it independent of the people, whether there is a founder or are founders, whether there's anybody good or capable associated with the concept. We pursue the market. And our first test in anything we evaluate is how big the market is and how the dynamics of the market work. And I will tell you one anecdote that is true. In 1987, a good friend, Ed Leonard, lawyer, called and said, I have
Turned
this...
investment banker.
Right. I have this company. The people are so unreasonable that only you could possibly deal with them. I had to think for a minute because I knew there was a compliment somewhere buried in that paragraph. So we...
Don, by the way, I've got you written down here as making the statement, founders are genetically impossible by choice.
Well, this founder, one of these founders, is in the museum where he belongs. We began engaging with this team and had heard from other sources that other people had talked to them. They were just too difficult to deal with. They were impossible. Wasn't worth it. We persevered. We happened to understand the market exceptionally well, in part because of an investment we did with Tom called Vitalink. And we understood something about networks. This company turned out to be Cisco Systems. We were among the only people in North America interested in this group of people. For $2.5 million, we bought a third of the company. And the deal was very simple. You guys do the science, we'll do the financing, and we'll bring in the management team and the management process subsequently. So we made that investment despite the fact there was not one person remotely genetically close to ever being a manager of anything.
That was a couple one.
But let's...
I agree with you, totally.
Really? This is the first.
I know.
Let's shift gears here a little bit and talk about the bubble and what history lessons there are for us. And Pitch, can you give us a perspective?
Well, the only thing, I think the main thing about the bubble was that venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, investment bankers, and customers all lost sight of the fact that companies are supposed to earn money. Companies are supposed to earn money. There's supposed to be some plan somehow to build a real company with sales and earnings and growth. And the bubble was based on, in my view, people's high expectations that somehow out there you might be building a company, but that somebody was going to pay more for the stock than you were. So the bubble, to oversimplify, was caused by a lack of discipline by venture capitalists and by bankers and by the ultimate customers in trying to see what is a real company being built here. I think the pattern for real companies was set by Dave and Bill and other, Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett, who tried from the beginning to get great wealth. They tried to build a great company and did that. And when that got lost sight of in this turmoil and turbulence around the internet, that's when the bubble started, and it wasn't until a couple of years ago that we got back to doing it right by looking for earnings. I think many venture capitalists, every guy on this panel and many in the audience, tried to keep the discipline, and did in many cases, but the discipline of the venture capital business got lost in there when it came to trying to build real companies.
Tom, in February 2000, you predicted at a conference in New Zealand during the America's Cup that the internet bubble was about to burst, and in fact it did 2 months later. 2 questions for you. How did you know that?
That was a month. That was a month later.
And how come you didn't tell the rest of the partners at Kleiner Perkins?
Well, my partners were very unhappy about that speech, which got picked up and publicized in this country. And by the time, however, that we'd arranged for a lunch that I'd be taken to the woodshed, the bubble had started to burst, so my predictions were starting to come true. I think everybody knew the bubble was going to burst. I don't think I had any insight whatsoever. It was musical chairs. Just people thought they could get out in time before it burst. It was an insane situation. And for the first time in my life, really, I took my advice seriously and shorted a lot of things in February of 2000. And it was pretty good timing. But I totally agree with Pitch. I think particularly the investment bankers, excuse me, Arthur, but I mean, but the word investment banker, I mean, 2 wonderfully secure, responsible. I mean, they would take anything public, anything. It just didn't matter. And so I think there was this complete loss of discipline on Wall Street. And we're paying the price, and we're going to continue to pay it for quite a while, I think.
Bert, what's your perspective?
Not a lot to add. Just, it's amazing how high things can go. One comment I will make that is not specific to this bubble, but is something that I believe has been true for all of the companies that I've been associated with that became public. The price of the stock of a public company is always, in my opinion, and that of my partners, is always either much too high, or it's much too low, or it's changing rapidly from one of those states to the other. And it is alarming to have companies go public for that reason. When you're private, nobody knows what this thing is worth, except occasionally at financings, and everybody knows that the price at which financings are done is always wrong with hindsight. It's either too high or too low. But public companies are very difficult.
Bill?
Well, I think I agree with everything that has been said, but I would add that we were on a big wave, and there was a horizon that wasn't very clear. There was, and I'm not saying 99 versus 2000, there was a period at which the whole world was changing, and we were getting more productive as a country, and a lot of it was the technology brought about by the internet and this whole new wave of wonderful effectiveness. So much was brought into your living room or your office, and so much could be done, and things were happening so fast that there was an extravagant exuberance that was the bubble, but still we all underestimate where we were in this big sea. It was not so clear that it was all over. There were different companies that were going under for sure and going down. There were other companies who were just coming up. The question of, does advertising work over the net? And since That's the big thing. It's more eyeballs. And of course, they're all right. What we did was we get sucked in to the belief that, gee, if we can just get more eyeballs, and the entrepreneur is saying, yeah, more eyeballs. And we say, yeah, more eyeballs. And it does become infectious. And so that kind of thing is very complicated. And I think this valley has created so many great companies, great products, great services, that I hope, you know, that there won't be just a total drag on backing new companies, because there are some great companies. Cisco was started in the middle 80s when things were kind of dead in the venture world, and I think we'll see another wave, but it should be 5 or 10 years away before we have, you know, before we get respect, perhaps.
I thought you were going to say before we have another bubble.
But what I was going to say, yeah, there'll be another bubble, and there was in '83 when Art Rock's picture was on Time magazine. That was the peak. I knew. I sold everything I had when he ended up on.
So did I.
And it's a fascinating time to be here in the Valley, because we have all this talent, we've got all this energy, and we've got all this money. But it's still too easy to look for a little niche that really isn't a business. And as Pitch said early on, our job is to help create businesses that will last, not to, till you have an exit. The first time when I came back from Washington and the UN, I came back and I heard all these new phrases like exits. It's just a certain time till we get exit. And what's your exit plan? Well, the guy's just starting his business, and you're wondering, well, what's the exit plan? And I don't think any of us thought that way. I think we were really trying to build companies that lasted, and we didn't even think about when we sell. But the bubble caused everybody to say, geez, I can get out. I get that IPO, and I'm going to get out, and if only. And then the ethics come into it, because even venture capitalists, who are the most ethical of all industries, bar none. No, but I'm dead serious. This is a group of totally ethical people but you tend to get sucked into saying, well, let's go public. We used to never think of taking a company public if we couldn't see a 20% growth in earnings, as Pitch said, and there were real earnings. Now, you don't, at this year peak of 2000, peak of the bubble, you thought, boy, let's get it out, let's get it out, let's get it out. It's like we're selling salami and trying to fake the public. And we used to always think, you don't want to sell anything that isn't going to be solid, or you ruin your reputation and everything. And that's basically what's been happening. So I don't think any present company is in that category. But I've got to say that is one major problem with the current thinking, which is changing, of course.
Art, as Bill noted, there were bubbles before. Do you have a perspective on what we should learn or should have learned from them?
Well, all the panelists here are company builders. What happened, I think, is that there were a whole bunch of promoters versus the builders. And the promoters, as Bill said, are interested in quick exits. I was a limited partner in an investment, a very small investment banking firm, Volpe Welty. And Tom used to tell me, Tom Volpe, that venture capitalists would call him up and say, what stocks are hot? Because we want to go into that business because we know we can get out. And when I heard that, I kind of turned my stomach. But I'll tell you, it's the promoters It's not the company builders. We collectively build companies. I'm not interested. I've been on the board of Intel for 34 years. I was on the board of Teledyne for 35 years. And I'm not interested in making a quick buck, and I don't think any of us are. I mean, we all like to make money, but this quick buck business is what gets the bubbles, and I think we're going to be in for a long, long siege before we come out of this. I don't know, whether it's going to go down very much from here, because it's down so much, but I think it's going to be a long, long time. And I don't think people are going to be calling up investment bankers and saying, what's hot out, and then look for a company in that business.
Don, your perspective?
This question has been drifting around for a long time, and I've been answering it strugglingly for a long time. So I decided to invent an answer that no one would believe, but at least that some of them would be entertained by it. So I explained the bubble as having been created by extraterrestrials that somehow or other invaded the 408 area code. They conducted a lunch at the Fairmont Hotel, invited all the venture capital people, and we all drank the Kool-Aid that was laced with stupid pills. I'll tell you a true story in the middle of the anecdote. We see companies at Sequoia on 90-minute intervals. So 2 companies I saw back to back, both software companies. First group came in, gave their pitch, same number of people, software developers. I asked my normal question, what are the channels of distribution? How are you going to sell this stuff? The guy looked at me rather incredulously and said, we're not going to sell it, we're going to give it away. Software, we're going to give it away. Okay, I'll bite. How do you get paid? Well, we're going to be in the services business. We'll get revenue and profits from all this other advertising and marketing, and I made myself a little note. I wouldn't invest in this guy on a bet. Next guy, software company, same pitch. 30 guys working night and day developing software. I got to my question, what are the channels of distribution? And he said, well, we're going to set up direct sales in this country, reps in Europe. And I said rather disappointingly, you're not going to give it away? And the guy said, are you crazy? We're working night and day to develop this stuff. We're going to sell it at 80% gross margins. I thought to myself, they're not all extraterrestrials out there. Some of the good guys are still out there creating companies. I don't know how it all happened, but there was somewhat of a third-party effect. The limited partners of the world supply tax-exempt money from your university's endowment or pension plans or something like that. And there had been a tsunami of money building up from the mid-90s. Billions of dollars were rolling into the partnerships in venture capital. Billions. Remember, Tom said, it seems like 10 hours ago, that he started the largest fund in North America at $7 million. Well, no self-respecting limited partner would invest that little. So money came in by the tens of billions of dollars into a closet industry that had no way to accommodate this other than investing in extraterrestrials and duplicating each other's investments. So there was something in that Kool-Aid, and happily I think we have all weaned ourselves from that diet. And wherever those people came from, they've gone home.
We're running late here, but no one's fidgeting in their seats quite yet, so we'll take time for a few questions. There are people with microphones. If you would raise your hand. There's a question up here in the front. I think his hand. His hand was up first over here. We'll catch you. The gentleman in the second row. Raise your hand. Raise your hand.
He just doesn't want to see you.
We haven't budgeted.
Yeah, it works. Okay.
Thank you. The disparaging comment about investment bankers reminds me of my cousin who was an investment banker and said his job description was to pass money from hand to hand, taking about 10% each time till it eventually disappeared.
Well, my favorite thing about investment bankers is they have all the self-restraint of lobotomized sharks.
But I do have a real question. I think the talk about promoters versus people who are building companies is entirely appropriate, and yet I see no movement away from the short-term focus that will hang any manager on his next quarter's results. And I'd like to hear the panel's comments about that.
Anybody want to?
Well, I'll just have a brief comment on that. Our job mostly is to work with private companies. And we do not get that excited. We want to see the progress in engineering or in marketing and sales growing. And if a tough quarter comes along, nobody gets that excited. You're speaking, of course, of the public markets, and many of us stay on public boards. But it is the analysts, in their wisdom, do get excited, and they say that a down quarter may mean bad things and may be leading to disaster. But from the venture capitalist point of view, in the building phase, we do look quarters ahead and years ahead and look for progress in the various components of the business that we think will lead to building the earnings and profits of the future.
Other questions?
I'm Sam Usselton, and I'm a software techie. Been out in the Valley since about '89. And shortly after I got here, I started having these interesting conversations with my dad, who's a finance prof, Texas A&M School of Business, sorry. And he was very leery about the whole technology part of the market because the methods he was comfortable with for analyzing what a company is worth worked just fine for the steel mills and so forth, but didn't seem to work real well for a technology company where it seems to be more the ideas and the IP have a lot to do with the value of the company.
So the question is, how do you gauge the value of a company based on ideas, intellectual property, market?
How do you gauge the value of a technologically based company as opposed to a nuts and bolts company?
Any panelists want to take a shot at that?
Well, are you talking about when the entrepreneur brings the idea to you, or are you talking about a company out there right now that's in existence?
I think the question was when a startup comes to see a venture capitalist. Yeah.
Well, I could take a crack at that. In the height of the bubble, a team of about 8, I think it was 8 engineers came in, and they had a software proposal, and I said, well, what do you think it's worth? They wanted to raise not too much money, a couple of $3 or $4 million. And what do you think you're worth? And they said, well, they said about $8 million. And I said, well, how'd you come to that? And they said, well, we figure we've got 8 engineers, and that's all they said. I said, well, why didn't you hire 4 more? That would there's a lot of Kentucky windage on the valuation when people come as a team, or when, and it usually is 3 or 4 people, and typically heavyweight on engineering. And so it is a complex process, but I think all of us have seen in the earlier days times when I can remember saying, well, look, we'll put up all the money, you put up all the blood, sweat, and tears, and we'll split the company, this with the founders. Then if we have to hire more people, we'll all come down evenly, and it'll be kind of a 50-50 arrangement. Well, as this bubble got bigger and bigger, they were coming in and said, well, we'll give you, for all the money, 5%, 10% of the deal, and so it's a supply and demand thing. It's gone back the other way now, but in starting with a team, it's typical thing to do is say, well, somewhere 40 to 60% to divide it. Now, if they've got the best thing since sliced bread, and you think they have it, and they think they have it, then you'll probably lose the deal because one of these guys will grab it. But anyway, I think it's very much that kind of a partnership thing is the way it should get started. And when it finally gets going, we're back to basics. I mean, people were going public at 20 times earnings or whatever, but we're not going public with no earnings and no prospect of earnings for many years. That's changed now.
Other questions?
My name's Alistair Davidson. I have a question for the group of you. Obviously, you're all famous. You're legends in your field. And it's often easier to succeed in the early stages of a market, such as the early stages of venture capital. As the market matures, the rules for success change. What are the lessons you think that you've learned that no longer apply?
I'd make just a couple of comments on that. I think one of the lessons to be learned is that the collegiality among venture firms that was characteristic of the business when we got into it and for quite a long period of time has gone and is likely to stay away. I see signs that some of it is coming back, and it's possible to get your partners to agree to permit sharing a deal with somebody else. But to first order, that's gone away because the venture capital business has become a very big business with a lot of players. And it's become really very intensely competitive. Thinking of what's different now and not different, when we were getting started, we were in a capital-starved climate, as you've heard. And if a particular company got started, it was very likely that that was going to be the only venture-backed startup that was going to get funded in that area. And as a result, some of these companies that got funded, I mean, Rome didn't have real competition for years, Tandem didn't for years. And that is a benefit that current entrepreneurs would die for, to be able to start something and not have 19 other people just like you competing with you early on. Now, there are benefits, though, to that, and that is looking at Sun Microsystems. I don't know how many workstation companies there were when Sun got started, and Sun had to start in this most intensely competitive environment and learn how to survive in this intensely competitive environment, and it made them a much stronger company than they might have otherwise been.
A couple more? Yes, Dave. Oh, no, with the mic. Oh, all right.
Yeah, I have the mic.
I don't think we can work that.
Right now, when you ask people about what to invest in, the only thing that people seem to have consensus about is security. My question is, did you see the waves coming that really built this business, the PC wave, the internet wave, historically? Are you seeing anything now? What should we be? When will we have something that will really turn the crank to get to the next stage? I mean, what's your thoughts about how to look for that?
The last big invention was a semiconductor. And all of the companies we're talking about here are all built on the semiconductor. Everything you can think of, personal computers, medical equipment, internet, whatever you can think of, were all built on the semiconductor. Before that, 50 years earlier, you had electricity. 50 years before that, you had the engines, mechanical things. I don't know maybe somebody here does, if they do, please tell me, where the next big invention is that's going to change the course of history, the way the semiconductor did, the way electricity did, the way the engines did.
Well, Arthur, I think it's biotechnology. It came along after the semiconductor, and I think we're still on the ground floor of that.
The problem with biotech, I agree with you that it's going to be very big, but it doesn't employ many people.
What was that, Art?
Well, I don't think it employs many people the way computers in the semiconductor industry employs
But it
people.
is separate from silicon, and it was genetic engineering was a major scientific step that's enabled some very great companies to grow, and also has enabled an awful lot of people to be cured of things they wouldn't otherwise be cured of. In terms of jobs, I don't have much of an argument. In terms of effect on our business and its effect on people's lives, I think it's comparable in that sense, genetic engineering.
The best investment I feel that we made at Sutter Hill was Hybridtech, because they invented the PSA test, and that saved my life. I had prostate cancer, and boy, I was glad they came up with that, because it was discovered that way. So you're dead right.
And the guy that started Hybridtech is sitting in the audience. His name is Brooke Byers.
Yeah.
Question there, and then Dave. Try it.
Well, first for Tom Perkins, congratulations on going short in February of 2000. And could you just send me a line when you're going long?
What was that?
Many people say that the venture capitalists Valley really are keen to see patents in the startups that come to them. I wanted to ask how true that was. My impression is that actually of the great startups that have grown, they haven't grown on the basis of patents and the law. They've grown on the basis, and by the way, Cooley is Fenwick is my patent attorney. So,
almost a Freudian slip there. That's right.
Yes. But going back to that question, has it been your experience that that's really been as valuable, and how much do you actually look for that?
Do the panelists look for patents?
Yes. In the case of biotechnology, I think patentability is very important. Less so in anything in the electronics area, because the giant companies have such enormous portfolios that you'll almost certainly get into cross-licensing anyway.
Dave?
Yeah, in the middle of the bubble, talking to one of the most ethical friends I've got, who is a very successful venture capitalist. You know, I asked, I mean, this can't go up forever, can it? I mean, this is gonna burst sometime, right? He says, well, of course it's gonna burst. But, you know, if you're in and out a few times, and when it finally bursts, you don't stupidly spend all the money you made on the way up trying to save the companies on the way down, you're gonna make a huge amount of money for your investors. And here's my key question for you. He said it would be irresponsible not to play the game on the way up. Because, yeah, it's not real, but it's what your investors are paying you to do.
Yeah, that's the ethics.
Yeah. Did you resist? And how did you justify resisting if you did?
I retired in '95.
Art, did you invest in the bubble?
No. Good, just little bits, but nothing of any major consequence. I wish I sold some more stock, though.
We all do.
Gordy, a couple more.
Yeah, two more questions. You've got one over there, and where's the next one?
Here. Two over here.
Hi, I'm Jim
John,
Harper.
do we have time for four? Okay, we'll do all four of them.
I have a question about early stage financing, whether the doors are closed in venture capital for a company that's just starting, getting off the ground, is pre-revenue, and if they are, where you do go. We've got a company that is in that situation. We've gone through friends and family. We got more than a third of our net worth in. I think it's 110% right now personally. And we're approaching venture, and we're being told, well, come back when you've got significant revenue, come back when you're cash positive or almost, and we're saying, okay, fine, how do we get there? So that's my question. Can we still go to your ranks, or are you all too gun shy to fund early stage companies?
I can say Kleiner and Perkins is still doing it, and I'll give you our phone number if you don't.
And Draper Fisher Jervis and Tim Draper's in the audience. He'd probably bite for that one.
I hope that we see much more venturesomeness on the part of venture capitalists than we are currently seeing. It's a fabulous time to be making investments, and yet a number of venture firms are doing that, but a number are really very much on the sidelines, and are sort of traumatized by the bubble, and are also acting really silly, I think, in that they overpaid. They paid market prices, but they overpaid during the bubble, and now, having done that, they feel that when they're going to finance a new company, somehow that company owes it to them to sell to them stock at a below market price, as opposed to doing a fair valuation at the time. And that's crazy. That's crazy. You've just got to get fair valuations done.
We're financing 2 companies a month, and have been financing 2 companies a month, and our opinion is that this is the best of times. Every recession that's happened since 1980 has been the best of times for us. And we assume something similar will happen, that the companies financed now with great people, great ideas, at very attractive pricing will provide us with fabulous opportunities 5 or 6 years from now.
Let's just take one more question here. I'm sure the panelists will be available afterwards. It's right here on the aisle.
Right. In answering to that question, working for a company that has gotten money from some of the firms represented here, it does still work. My question follows on to the one here about where the gentleman said the VCs owed it to their investors. I wonder if you could talk about how has your relationship with your limited partners changed over the years? When you started out with these $6 and $7 million record-breaking funds, did you have to beat the bushes like crazy to raise that? Were people saying, "Oh boy, about time. Here's the money"?
When we began in the second venture I was involved with was with Reed Dennis and Burgess Jameson and Jim Norris. We set out to raise a $15 to $20 million fund in the early fall of 1973. We spent 6 months full-time raising the money, finally raised a $19 million fund in April and May of '74, and that was 1/3 of the private capital raised by the venture capital industry in the U.S. in 1974. It was very painful. If we would talk to potential financing sources, and if most of them would say, "You're crazy, we would never do such a thing." And if someone said, "Well, there's only a 10% chance that we would think of investing in something like that," we felt we had a live one, and we all went to see the person. It's a very different time, very different time.
With that, I want to thank the panel and draw it to a close here with a couple of observations from the Magnificent Seven. Because I knew Don had put together that trailer, I rented the movie last night and watched it for the first time in about 12 years. And Don, I was looking for allegories to the venture capital business, and I found 2. At the very beginning of the movie, Eli Wallach, who's the villain, the bandit who's been terrorizing this village, complains to his compatriots, robbing stages isn't as easy as it used to be. They don't carry as much gold these days. So I don't know whether there's an analog to venture capital. But at the end of the movie, one of the good guys asks Yul Brynner, who's the leader of the good guys, "Why are you continuing to defend this village when they don't want you to do it anymore?" And he says, "Because we made a contract." And his buddy says, "But it's not the kind of contract that they would enforce in a court of law." And Yul turns back to Steve McQueen and says, "That's just the kind you need to keep." So with that, I want to thank those panelists who kept their promises. And